And the teacher said, we found America. We fought the war. We gained independence from the wicked King George, and we discovered the West. We learned it the best, and we made great cities from a little or less. Then we built the train, which really gave us our name, pushing us into a time called the Industrial Age. And oh, you should be proud. Oh, look at us now because we, wow. Meanwhile, the students thought, why can't we find we in the lesson that he taught? When he says we, something in the lesson feels off. Teacher, I have a question. When you say we, are we included in that expression? Not we as in we, but we as in me. And not me as in me, but me as in we's that look like me. And I know that you already talked about slavery. But that isn't enough to satisfy the craving in my soul, to be proud of the position that I hold inside of the whole. When you say we, who is me in the context of we? What happens when children of color can't see the me in we? For the past 10 years of my career in education, I've spent countless hours sitting through professional developments, talking to fellow teachers, and reading the latest best practice research on how to engage children of color. You see, it's the elephant in the room in most schools. We talk about raising the expectations for all children. We talk about restorative practices for all children. But we know that these issues of disengagement and low achievement disproportionately affects children of color. Almost 80% of black and brown children can't read at grade level. Children of color are 5 times more likely to be suspended or expelled from school, more likely to be labeled as special needs or special education, more likely to drop out. And I haven't even talked about the school to prison pipeline yet. Almost 50,000 children in the United States, 50,000 children are in juvenile detention centers, and 64% of that is black or brown. You see, what we want to know is how do we engage those children? You see, we often blame external factors, poverty, lack of 2 parents in the home, inequity or inequality of resources, negative peer pressure. But what's interesting and frustrating at times is that even when you remove those external factors, many of these issues still persist. Take poverty, for example. Even in scenarios where poverty is not a barrier and children of color come from affluent 2-parent households, they're still outperformed by their white counterparts. In fact, white children that are labeled low socioeconomic status often perform equally or better than children of color not labeled the same. And since Brown versus Board of Education, even despite all of our education initiatives, the achievement gap has narrowed in some years, but invariably stayed consistent. You see, we fail so often because we are misunderstanding this issue. We have to stop focusing on isolated external factors and take a closer look at internal factors. In my second year of teaching, I was mentoring a group of African-American boys on my lunch break. In the midst of the conversation, one of the boys shouted out, "Mr. Moore, why are we black?" I said, well, we're black because of something called melanin. I mean, everybody has melanin. We just have a little more, which makes us a little darker. Then I said, but melanin has a lot of great benefits. One of the best benefits of melanin is protection from the sun. He looked. He said, oh. The next morning, he came running down the hallway. He said, Mr. Moore, I told my mom what you said about the reason why we were black because of something called melanin. I don't think I've ever heard that much pride in his voice. This was a profound moment for me because out of all the things that I had taught him, what resonated the most was the reason why he was black. And what's more, that being black had some benefit. Let me ask you a question. When was the first time that you recognized what your race was? You see, studies show that children of color recognize their race as early as 3 years old. I remember when my baby girl first started school. She was only one of 3 children of color in her classroom. And about 3 months into kindergarten, she came home one day and said, Daddy, why are we brown people? You see, how do children of color discover race? And more importantly, when they discover it, how do they make meaning of it? You see, all things considered equal, children of color, academically and developmentally, progress equally to their white counterparts, all the way up until about the 4th grade. Something happens in the 4th grade. Theorists like Dr. Jawan Kunjufu call it the fourth grade phenomenon. In fourth grade, children of color become disinterested in school. This disengagement has a direct correlation with identity development, and more importantly for children of color, racial identity. Dr. William Cross, one of the first theorists to situate racial identity development into a framework, found that we develop our racial identity in stages. And what takes us from the first stage of incognizance, where race within itself is not an important factor for identity development, and moves us into the second stage of awareness, where race becomes a dominant factor for identity development, or what he calls encounters. Encounters are shocking, personal, or social events that temporarily dislodges us from our present understanding of our identity and moves us into a new interpretation of who we are and our place in society. In more layman's terms, encounters are temporary identity crises. You see, these encounters can positively inform our identity or negatively inform it. You see, the most important existential question is, who am I? And from birth, we begin to answer that question. Every time we have an encounter and our identity is temporarily dislodged, we are answering the question, who am I? And simultaneously, we're being told who we can be. You see, that day that my daughter came home and asked, Daddy, why are we brown people? I knew that she had had an encounter. An encounter like, why is my skin darker than theirs? An encounter like, why do I say my words differently from they do? An encounter like, why is my hair kinky curly? And although these encounters may be innocent, they bring awareness to difference. But it's okay to be different. And it's okay to feel different as long as your difference doesn't make you feel less valuable than anyone else. You see, what's important isn't necessarily the encounter. The encounter is a natural part of identity exploration. What's important is the interpretation of that encounter. You see, without positive racial socialization, children of color often grow to believe that to be non-white also means to be inferior. You see, the boy in my class that day, he wasn't asking why was he black from a scientific standpoint. He was asking, why do I have to be black from an identity standpoint? When you come to the realization that race is fixed, and you believe that your race is inferior, children of color often grow to believe that inferiority is an inescapable reality. Prolonged feelings of inferiority creates psychopathologies, and these psychopathologies are often classified in school as disengagement, low achievement, learning disabilities, oppositional defiance, or just flat out misbehavior. You see, if I'm destined to be inferior, then why try? Prolonged feelings of inferiority create hopelessness. It creates the fourth grade phenomenon. Positive racial socialization is an idea that has been alluded to by many theorists. Theorists like Dr. Alfred Boykins, Dr. Robert Sellers, or Dr. Joy DeGruy. Positive racial socialization is the intentional communication of positive messages, not just for one race, ethnicity, or culture, but for all races, ethnicities, and cultures. To be clear, it's the intentional communication of positive messages about people of color. You see, it's inevitable that we will have racial socialization of some sort. It's inevitable that we will have a racial encounter. What's not guaranteed, however, is that socialization, that encounter will be positive. In fact, it's more probable that the encounter and the socialization will be negative, particularly negative about those races that are non-white. You see, our society is saturated with negative socializations for people of color. From the movies and television shows that we watch, where the criminals and the villains and the antagonists are often brown-skinned people or darker complexioned characters, to the language that we speak. Two small words, black and white. These two words carry a lot of meaning in American society. The term black is often seen as negative and bad, whereas the term white is often seen as positive and good. Like, no one ever wants to be blackballed to become the black sheep of the family. And good witches, well, they use white magic. Bad witches, they use black magic. And it's okay to tell a little white lie, but never try to blackmail somebody. And I haven't even told you about angel food cake and devil food cake yet. The interpretation of words and images are powerful, and they can direct the thinking of societies. Here's a simple test. I want you to close your eyes for a second. Now tell me what image comes to mind when I say the word hero, patriot, humanitarian, genius. Was it a white person that you thought of? Just keep your eyes closed for just a second. Now I want you to keep your eyes closed, and this time, tell me what comes to mind when you think of criminal, terrorist, delinquent. Was it a person of color? You see, this simple social experiment is the base foundation of Harvard's implicit bias test. The reality that negative attributes are often associated with people of color, or positive attributes are often associated with people of non-color. Whites perceive negatively, and people of color internalize negatively. What has your socialization taught you? And what is it teaching our children? You see, when children have a positive framework to encounter race, they show resilience in the face of negative encounters and resistance to implicit bias. Well, how do we instill that positive framework? Well, it starts at home. You see, we've been talking about teachers and schools, but in the lives of children, parents are the first teachers, and home is their first school. So parents of color have to painstakingly help their children develop positive racial identities and provide them with a positive framework to interpret from. You see, studies show that when children of color have positive racial identities, they're less affected by negative encounters and they reject stereotypes. For white parents, it's the opposite. See, the value of whiteness has already been embedded in our society, in our culture. So you have to work to provide your children with a positive framework to encounter children that may not look like them. You see, if my black child was to come into your home, would she feel as valued as your children? Do the movies you watch have black and brown princesses and heroes? Do the bedtime stories you tell stories about little brown children on a journey? Are the action figures and dolls they play with brown with kinky hair? Are you intentionally exposing your children to a culture outside of their own? Because studies show that when people, not just children, but when people have positive experiences with other races, ethnicities, and cultures, they're more resilient and resistant to implicit bias. You see, I know that most of us are raising our children in homogeneous family structures, but we have to prepare them for the heterogeneous global society that we're raising them in. And many times, it's children providing these negative encounters to each other. In a study I recently did called Learning While Black, an exploration of microaggressions in school context, I found that 90% of children of color said their most impactful negative encounter was with a white classmate. And oftentimes a classmate that they considered to be a friend. And according to another study done by the Southern Poverty Law Center, they found that since 2017, white nationalist hate groups have grown by 55%. And their growth and their recruitment was heavily dependent on white adolescent males. You see, a positive framework to encounter race could prevent both of these. And teachers, when those students leave home and they come into our classroom, we have to move away from the Eurocentric hegemonic education and move closer to a humanitarian-centered education. In other words, we have to stop teaching the history of the world through the lens of European exploration and conquest. You see, in the lives of children, school is the most common location for racial encounters and identity crises, not just with classmates and teachers, but also what's being implicitly taught. You see, it's an encounter to read about princesses and princes that may not look like you. And it's an encounter to learn about great thinkers and explorers, scientists and mathematicians that aren't from your ancestors. It's an encounter to read about oppression, and your people are the ones being oppressed. You see, the conquest of Julius Caesar and the greatness of the Roman Empire has to be coupled with the conquest of Mansa Musa and the greatness of the Ghanaian Empire. When we praise the astrological discoveries of Galileo, we have to acknowledge that his discoveries stood on the backs of the many constellation maps that were created by the ancient Africans, the ancient Chinese, and ancient Native American civilizations that came before him, and advanced by people like Neil deGrasse Tyson after him. Native American legends, Asian myths, and African folklore can replace nursery rhymes like Mary Had a Little Lamb and Jack and Jill Went Up the Hill. Middle school classes and high school classes have to be filled with the work of Lorraine Hansberry, James Baldwin, Paulo Freire, and Juan Rulfo. You see, children have to be able to see excellence in all cultures, in all races, in all nationalities, outside of the context of white dominant culture, outside of the context of European exploration, and outside of the context of inferiority. You see, 155 years after the Emancipation Proclamation and 66 years after Brown versus Board of Education and 12 years after the election of America's first black president, Barack Obama, it's hard not to ask, isn't anything better? Of course it is. But children of color still disproportionately represent low achievement scores, special education classes, suspension and expulsion rates, juvenile detention centers, crime rates, and dropout rates. You see, the unfortunate events of 2020 have allowed us the ability to take a step back. It's allowed us as educators to take a step back. It's allowed us as parents to take a step back and reevaluate our effectiveness in really creating truly equitable communities, truly equitable schools, and raising children with truly equitable ideas. You see, for far too long, excellence, beauty, and intelligence has been defined by whiteness in our society. But whiteness is not something that children of color can ever attain. And so if we truly want all children to thrive, we have to provide them with a framework that they can see themselves in. By providing our children with a positive framework to encounter race, we not only teach them to love the skin that they're in, but we teach them to appreciate others that may not look like them. We teach them that unity is not uniformity. And we teach them that there's beauty in difference. So teacher, I have a question. When you say we, are we included in that expression? Not we as in we, but we as in me. And not me as in me, but me as in we's that look like me. And I know that you already talked about slavery. But that isn't enough to satisfy the craving in my soul, to be proud of the position that I hold inside of the whole when you say we. So please explain to me your current position as it relates to your disposition in creating a classroom, the school, a community, and a society that will make me feel proud when you say we. Children of color just want to be able to see the me in we. Thank you.